Assalamu alaikum. Hello there. I'm Datin Rosna, and this is my second lecture in the series of lectures focusing on report structure. In this particular lecture, I will be looking at what is a report, just a quick recap of the first lecture, why do we write reports, or more specifically, why do you have to write reports? Then I'll look at the main sections of a report. Again, it's a recap from the first lecture. And finally, I will talk about structuring your report, i.e., focusing on what you should include in the sections of the report that you will be writing. In my first lecture on report structure, I mentioned that report writing differs from essay writing because a report has a different purpose from an essay. So, just to recap, what is a report? Reports are written for a particular purpose. They usually outline a problem, provide the relevant facts and ideas to the situation, and then recommend a course of action. Reports are highly structured so that information they contain can be easily understood. Headings within the report allow the reader to select the parts they wish to read, and headings also enable each section of the report to stand alone. So the structure of a report is enhanced through the use of subheadings, diagrams, tables, graphs, illustrations, etc. But perhaps the real question is, why do you have to write reports? Why do we write reports? You will be asked to write reports to show that you have investigated or researched a particular problem. The main purpose of a report is to provide information to the readers about something, such as how to solve a problem, a description of a situation or process, to propose recommendations, or to provide information to the readers about the outcomes of a laboratory experiment or a research project that has been undertaken, the assessment of a client's needs, or an investigation of an incident, such as how a workplace accident occurred and what measures need to be taken to prevent a similar incident from happening again. The amount and type of information that is included in a report should be based on what the audience will need or want to know. For example, the information required in a report detailing the outcomes of a scientific experiment will differ from a business report detailing some potential marketing strategies for a new product. There are many report formats used in different academic disciplines and employment contexts. As a university student, you may be required to write the following types of report: an analytical report, a business report, a scientific report, a research report, or a report on the outcomes of a specific project. Certain disciplines or faculties will require their students to write reports for specific purposes. For example, nursing or health science students may need to write reports identifying patient health needs in a hospital setting. Science and FIT students may be asked to write reports reporting the results of a laboratory experiment, and FAS and APB students may have to write reports presenting data which was collected during a field trip. Okay, now I want to look at the main sections of a report, something which I started in my first lecture and which I want to do in a bit more detail here. In my first lecture, I looked at the basic structure of a formal and informal reports. The components that we looked at in that lecture represent the most commonly found sections of a report. So, just to recap, the main sections of a report are described in the slides on your screen. Depending on the type and purpose of the report you are writing, you may not have to include all of the sections. Title page. The title page in a report provides a first impression about the contents of the report. The table of contents in a report provides important guides which allow the reader to find the information they need quickly. Acknowledgements. An acknowledgement section is included in a report to acknowledge or recognize and thank the efforts of those who contributed to the research or the writing of the report. Then there's the abstract or executive summary. The abstract is intended to give the reader an overview of the content they will find in your report. This should include the problem which was investigated, how it was examined, and the main issues and recommendations raised in the discussion section. This allows the reader to preview the report and decide if it provides them with information that will be useful for them to know more about. If not, then they can find a better source of information somewhere else. Then, of course, there's the introduction. The introduction in a report is similar to an introduction in an essay because it states clearly what you intend to cover in your paper. An introduction is different from an abstract because it outlines what you intend to present in your report. An introduction does not summarize what you have achieved in your research. The introduction also explains why you think your research is important, and it can be used to explain how you collected and analyzed the information which you will present in your report. However, in some reports, you may wish to cover some of this information in more detail in a separate literature review or methods section. Another main section of the report is the literature review. A literature review provides the reader with an understanding of what else has been written about the topic of your report. It helps the reader to understand how your research fits in with and adds to existing knowledge about the topic of your report. The literature review also helps you to explain why your research was important to do. The next main section of a report is the methods or methodology section. The methods section must provide enough detail to allow the reader to undertake the same research process or experiment that you are describing in your report at another time. This section can include information about who participated in the research or the sample, the equipment or software used for collection of information or data, the equipment or software used for the analysis of information or data, and a step-by-step description of how the information was collected. This section is commonly included in research or scientific reports, but not in business reports. A large portion of an investigative report deals with what was done to gather information, but the section is usually not called methods. An Important section of a report is the discussion section. This section is used to show how the information or results of your research relate to the problem being addressed in a business situation or the thesis being tested in scientific research. This is where the report writer will explain why they got the results they did and how this has an impact on the processes they were examining in their research. This can include the effects of this information outside the author's own organization or discipline. Then, of course, you have the conclusion. As in an essay, the conclusion is a summary of the main findings of the report, with a statement about how they can be used to resolve the main problem or issue which the report is intended to address. This may include making recommendations about such problems. The recommendation section. If there are obvious actions that can be taken as a result of the findings of a report, these are included in the form of recommendations. The recommendations may also be included in the conclusion section of the report. However, if one of the objectives of a business report has been to identify a process for organizational change, then it may be better to list the recommendations in a separate section. In a research report, the recommendations often indicate how the research project could be extended or improved in the future. In a legal report, for example, the recommendations usually identify who is responsible and what the consequences are for involvement in an incident. Then you have the references section. You should use the required referencing style when listing resources and references which contributed to the outcomes and findings of your report. At UBD, this is the APA style. And finally, the last section of a report is the appendices section. Any detailed information, such as sample questionnaires, which is not essential for the reader to understand the outcomes or conclusions of a report, but which can provide them with a more complete understanding of how the information was collected or analyzed, should be included as an appendix. This allows them to refer to the material if they wish to do so. By now, you must be quite familiar with the sections that make up the basic structure of a formal report. Do remember, however, that for your report assignment, you will be using the structure of the short, informal report. Okay. As I'm sure many of you are gearing up to begin work on your report, what I want to do now is to examine more closely the sections that you will need to write for your report. But before that, I just want to talk a little bit about the abstract or executive summary, even though the report that you will be writing for this module does not require you to prepare an abstract. The reason why I want to talk a little bit about the abstract or the executive summary is that the abstract or the executive summary acts like a shop window for your report. It is the first and sometimes the only section to be read by lots of people, but strangely enough, it should be the last bit of a report to be written. And it should enable the reader to make an informed decision about whether he or she wants to read the report itself. So the length of the abstract or the executive summary depends on the extent of the work reported. But usually an abstract is about a paragraph long or 2 paragraphs and always less than a page. And the abstract should briefly explain the purpose of the work or the study, the methods used for the research, the main conclusions reached, and any recommendations. So remember to include the above 4 elements when you have to write an abstract for your next report. Okay, so your first assignment requires you to prepare an introduction for your report. But what do you need to include in the introduction? Well, the introduction should explain the rationale for undertaking the work reported on and the way you decided to do it. It should include what you have been asked or chosen to do and the reasons for doing it. You should also state in the introduction what the report is about. What is the question you're trying to answer? If it is a brief for a specific reader, example, a feasibility report on a construction project for a client, then you need to say who they are. In your introduction, you can also describe your starting point and the background to the subject. For example, what research has already been done? If you have to include a literature review in your introduction, then it will be a brief one. What are the relevant themes and issues? Why are you being asked to investigate it now? These are things that you can also include in your introduction. You can also, in your introduction, explain how you're going to go about responding to the brief or the question. If you are going to test a hypothesis in your research, include this at the end of your introduction. Then, your introduction should include a brief outline of your method of inquiry. And finally, you need to state the scope and limits of your research and reasons for them. For example, this study will focus only on native English speakers as a proper consideration of the issues arising from speaking English as a second language is beyond the scope of this study. So, at once, you have established the parameter of your study. Now, you don't have to have all the above elements in your introduction, but a few of these elements are more or less compulsory. They are essential components in the introduction of a report. Can you figure out which ones they are? Work it out with your group members if you're still in doubt. Okay, now for the literature review. Although your informal report does not require a full-blown review of literature, you still have to show that you have done sufficient background reading, especially of print publications such as books, journals, and sometimes conference papers, on work that has already been done on the topic of your report. It should also include studies that have direct relevance to your research. In fact, it should only include studies that have direct relevance to your research. And you need to introduce your review by giving a critical summary of each work or source and showing its relevance to your research. When you're reviewing sources or when you're reviewing literature, you also need to explain any clear trends that you have noticed which have emerged in your research on the topic that you are working on. You need to group your sources according to themes or issues or trends or patterns. Conclude your literature review with how the review has informed your research. Are there still many gaps in the area? Still not much information? Can your study then fill the gaps, build on the insufficient information, and so on? Okay, now, what do you write in the method section? When you are writing out the section on methods or methodology, make sure you write it in such a way that a reader could replicate the research you have done. What this means is that you have to explain every step, every procedure as clearly as possible. State clearly how you carried out your investigation. Explain why you chose this particular method, whether it's the questionnaire method, focus group method, interviews, experimental procedure, etc. Then you must include the techniques and any equipment that you used. If there were participants in your research, you need to describe or explain who they were, how many, how were they selected, and you need to write this whole section concisely but thoroughly. Go through what you did step by step, including everything that is relevant. You know what you did, but could a reader follow your description? Okay, from the method section, I want to move on to the data analysis section where you also present your results or findings. Now, the data analysis section or the results or findings section has only one job, which is to present the findings of your research as simply as possible. Use the format that will achieve this most effectively. For example, you should be using texts, graphs, tables, diagrams, and so on. However, don't repeat the same information in two visual formats by using both a graph and a table. Then you need to label your graphs and tables clearly. You must give each figure a title and describe in words what the figure demonstrates. However, in this section, you do not write out the interpretation of your results. You save your interpretation of the results or of your findings for the discussion section. So because of that, the discussion section is a very important section in a report. And often it is the longest section. This is because the discussion section brings everything together. It is here that you have to show how your findings respond to the brief or the question or the purpose that you explained in your introduction. This is the section to mention if there were any problems. For example, if your results were different from expectation, or you couldn't find important data, or you had to change your method or participants, and how they were or could have been solved. Then in the conclusion of your report, there should be no new arguments or evidence. The conclusion section should be a short section. The conclusion should sum up the main points of your research. How do they answer the original brief or question for the work reported on. This section may also include recommendations for action and may also include suggestions for further research. However, the recommendations could also come in a separate section after the conclusion. Then, of course, the reference list follows, and it should list the full details for any work you have referred to in your report. For the correct style of referencing to use, check any instructions you may have been given. If you're uncertain about how or when to reference, see your notes on referencing. We're using the APA style of referencing. And finally, the appendices should include any additional information that may help the reader but is not essential to the report's main findings. For instance, you can put in the appendices interview questions, raw data, a glossary of terms used, and similar items. Make sure you label all appendices and refer to them where appropriate in the main body of your report. For example, see Appendix A for an example questionnaire. So, in this lecture, I started off by looking at what is a report, and then I went on to look at why do we write reports, or more specifically, why do you have to write reports. I also went through the main sections of a report again, and finally, I talked about what goes on in each section of your report. In other words, structuring your report, or what you should include in the sections of the report that you will be writing. As a follow-up to this lecture, I want you to print out handout L2B and complete the exercise in this particular handout. Remember, it's the handout labeled handout L2B. I will stop here, but I will see you in the next lecture when I will take you through some guidelines for report writing, and we will examine the format of a report in even greater detail. Till then, goodbye.